Welcome, welcome, welcome. We will begin in about 30 seconds. We'll let some folk come in on the chat. So please bear with us. Okay, it's 5:02 and we only have an hour with Ashley M. Jones, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Dr. Theodore Foster. Good afternoon. I'm an assistant professor of African American history at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. This is the third of 6 Black Studies speakers who are contributing to our Black Study Within and Beyond Crisis working group that makes space for UL students, faculty, and staff to more critically engage the work of Black study and the field of Black studies. To begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the UL College of Liberal Arts, UL English Department, and UL Department of History, Geography, and Philosophy, as well as the Gilbo Charitable Trust. I also want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Maria Seeger and Dr. Ian Beamish, for their work coordinating and supporting this opportunity, as well as my undergraduate research assistant, Connor Benoit, for his help with this event. I will now read a brief land acknowledgement drafted by my colleague, Dr. Marissa Petro, and First Nations group in the Louisiana area. Dr. Petro is the director of the Gilbo Center for Public History. UL Lafayette is on the land of the Atakapa Ishak. We honor the land. We honor the Atakapa Ishak and the land with gratitude. We would also like to express our gratitude to elders past, present, and future of the dozens of other First Nations in the Louisiana area, including the Chitimacha, Appaloosa, Abigail, Tunica, Biloxi, Jena Choctaw, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, and Coushatta. We also honor the peoples of African descent who were enslaved on this land when it was part of the Mouton family's sugar plantation. The center's full land acknowledgement can be found at www.gilbocenter.com/honor-native-land. Now, a bit more about the speaker series. Black Studies emerged within the university as a product of an institutional crisis with the ongoing condition of unfreedom for Black students, community, and life in 1969. Indeed, one of the impetus or one of the motivations for this speaker series was the student protest activism following this summer's uprisings in June of 2020. Black women poets such as Sonia Sanchez, June Jordan, and Toni Cade Bambara were among the first practitioners institutionally of Black studies within the university. In other words, the poetics of Black women and the labor of these Black women in the academy, among many more, became the vestibule through which the university incorporated Black study, which in the singular emphasizes the verb to study and references a pre-1969 global context for understanding the intellectual genealogy of Black thought, life, and cultural production. Much like our last speaker, Dr. Badur Alagra, emphasized that prolific Caribbean thinkers like Sylvia Wynter and Edward Louis Sant were writers first and academics second, Black women poets and writers served as the foundation for the development of Black studies within the halls of the academy, but emerged as scholars of Black study well before the institution cared to recognize. So what I want to do now is read, well, first, June Jordan published an essay foundational to our understanding of the distinction between Black studies and Black study, as Alagra was pointing out last week or on Wednesday. And this essay was titled Black Studies, Bringing Back the Person. And it was published in 1969 while she was teaching in the English department alongside Toni Cade Bambara at the City University of New York. So if I had more time, I would read that an excerpt from that essay, but I implore you all, I think it's readily available on Google if you just type in June Jordan, Black Studies, Bringing Back the Person. As a historian, as a Black Studies scholar, I'm always interested in how historical memory is conjured through music, through dance, through film, through visual art, and through poetry. So for my Black Women's History class, I've incorporated every other week or so, poetry as well as short stories by Black women to think through the kind of gaps and silences within the archive that historians use and have used more formally since 1970 to really center Black women as historical actors. Sonia Sanchez is a Birmingham native, much like myself and Ashley Jones. And she also, like June Jordan, was not in New York, but in San Francisco, a part of the student protests there that led to the establishment of ethnic studies and Black studies. Sonia Sanchez remains an important figure within the Black poetry world, and I would argue broader Black arts and humanities. And in many ways, she is with us as we think through the work of Ashley Jones today. There's a really new book from a Black studies scholar named Josh Myers. It's titled "We Are Worth Fighting For: A History of the Howard University Student Protest of 1989." And he opens his book by talking about Sonia Sanchez, who I've seen speak several times and has told this story several times about her first semester teaching at San Francisco State University in 1969, and that the FBI came to knock on her door because they were curious why she was teaching W.E.B. Du Bois, right, who in 1969 was still seen as part of this Red Scare kind of, criminalization of communism and Black socialism. That, for Sonia Sanchez as an English scholar and teacher, you can't teach Black studies without W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And today he's become canonical, not only in, secondary ed, but as well as, college. So he goes on to point out how Sonia Sanchez was central to motivating students to really, demand a higher quality of education at HBCU like Howard. And in this text, he has a really powerful statement about memory and history that, for me, is really central to a lot of the work that Ashley M. Jones does with her poetry in terms of activating historical memory in a way that historians alone cannot do. Myers writes, "The power of memory inheres in its ability to frame the future. Our memories create the pathways that we follow, that our descendants follow. In the face of modern assaults on our humanity, African intellectual traditions have, over the last 200 years, generated philosophies of history that were guided by the particular memories and modalities of people of African descent and people of African ancestry." So I read that as an effort to introduce Ashley M. Jones and her work. So let me get to a bit about her. Ashley M. Jones holds an MFA in poetry from Florida International University, and she is author of Magic City Gospel through Obsidian Press in 2017, Dark Thing through Pleiades Press in 2019, and Reparations Now through Obsidian Press in 2021. I think it comes out in September. Awesome. Her poetry has earned several awards, including the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, the Silver Medal in the Independent Publishers Book Awards, the Lena-Miles Wever Todd Prize for Poetry, a Literature Fellowship from the Alabama State Council of the Arts, the Lucille Clifton Poetry Prize, and the Lucille Clifton Legacy Award. She was a finalist for the Ruth, Lily, Dorothy, Sargent, Rosenberg Fellowship in 2020. Her poems and essays appear in or are forthcoming at CNN, Poetry, the Oxford American, Origins Journal, The Quarry by Split This Rock, Obsidian, and many others. She teaches creative writing at the Alabama School of Fine Arts and the Low Residency MFA at Converse College. Jones co-directs PEN Birmingham, and she is the founding director of the Magic City Poetry Festival, which began in 2018. And she'll tell us a bit more about how we can engage next month through this year's virtual engagement with the Magic City Poetry Festival. And she currently serves as the O'Neill Library's Lift Every Voice Scholar as a guest editor for Poetry Magazine. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ashley M. Jones, who will speak for around 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So I encourage you to stay around and ask questions. Ashley.
Thank you, Dr. Foster. Thanks for having me, first of all. Thanks to everybody who was a part of the organizing of this reading or talk, whatever you'd like to call it. Really excited to be here. I wanted to begin with two quick notes. First, I am a poet, and a lot of our performances rely on audience engagement and energy. And of course, this is a webinar, so I can't even see your names. But if, as I'm reading, you want to react to a piece, feel free. I'm saying this without having asked Dr. Foster first, but feel free to maybe utilize the chat for that. I love when people, put their reactions in the chat because it makes me feel like you're right here with me listening to the work. Hopefully that's all right, Dr. Foster, you'll tell me if it isn't. And then I also wanted to start with just a little quote that I found. Thank you, Dr. Foster, that I found in that essay that Dr. Foster mentioned. I don't call him, well, actually I do call you Dr. Foster in my real life. I was gonna say that I don't, but I definitely do call you that, even though I know you as a person rather than just a doctor. But in the essay that he mentioned by June Jordan, there's a quote in there from a moment where she's recalling walking to class with Toni Cade Bambara on her way to her first class, actually, of English composition. And she's a little bit nervous about what she's going to give to them. And Toni Cade Bambara says to her, anything you have to give, just give it to them. They'll be grateful for it, which is such a beautiful way to think about teaching and sharing in general. And without having known that quote before, that's sort of how I live my teaching and poet life. Whatever it is that I have to offer, I decide that it is enough and it will reach someone. So that's what I've come here with you for you today, is something about poetry and about the people who have influenced me, how Black women have really been the backbone of my life, but also my writing life, and how you can sort of track that through several authors. So if you see me looking off to the side, I have another screen here that I'm going to read from. And the document that I'm reading from, I have shared the link with Dr. Foster, and he can share it with you if you'd like to read along or use some of the references for further study. There's lots of links in here as well to further reading material. So I wanted to begin just by telling you a little bit about how I came to poetry, because my pathway to poetry actually involved Black women, two Black women specifically, Eloise Greenfield and Harriet Tubman. And so the quick version of the story is that as a 7-year-old, second grader, there was an assignment given for us to memorize something and then come to school and recite that thing. I was already a very bookish child. I loved reading and writing, and I had checked out the book Honey, I Love by Eloise Greenfield, and I had been reading it the whole week and was super excited about the poems that are in there. It's a book, I think, meant for children, but anybody can read it. And it's a very Black book. Eloise Greenfield is, of course, known for her very long career in writing about Black people in children's books and in other books as well. And so I had read this book and I knew that I wanted to recite the poem Harriet Tubman, because it had a sort of swing to it that I wasn't used to inhabiting as a very straight and narrow child. I spoke very, very proper English, and I yearned for that sort of just spirit that I saw in some of my family, my grandmother, my aunts, just the way that they could control language and control the room because of the way they controlled language. And so when I read this poem, I remember when I recited it, I remember feeling like, oh, this is the power I've been looking for. And after that moment, I started to write poetry. So I just want to share that poem with you, and then I'll share a poem of mine that kind of picks up where this one leaves off. Harriet Tubman by Eloise Greenfield. Harriet Tubman didn't take no stuff, wasn't scared of nothing neither. Didn't come in this world to be no slave and wasn't gonna stay one either. Farewell, she sang to her friends one night. She was mighty sad to leave them. But she ran away that dark, hot night, ran looking for her freedom. She ran to the woods and she ran through the woods with the slave catchers right behind her. And she kept on going till she got to the north where those mean men couldn't find her. 19 times she went back south to get 300 others. She ran for her freedom 19 times to save Black sisters and brothers. Harriet Tubman didn't take no stuff, wasn't scared of nothing neither. Didn't come in this world to be no slave, and didn't stay one either, and didn't stay one either. So I want to jump to another Tubman piece, but this one is by me. And it's a little less, I guess, palatable perhaps for children than the Greenfield piece. But I have several of these Tubman pieces in my second book, Dark Thing, which I wrote because I became sort of obsessed with her. And I also became obsessed with the idea that she was a human being. I think all of us know very well how Black women, Black people, but Black women specifically, are constantly dehumanized and illegitimized by society. And I wanted to write these pieces about her to reaffirm her personhood, but also to explore just who she was. And this poem that I'm going to read to you sort of talks about some of that dehumanization that is done not only by white people and whiteness, but by Black people too, unfortunately, in her case. But it also sort of positions Black women as the origin of everything, as godlike, which is not to say magical in like a dehumanizing way, but just to say the fact is Black women are the origin of everything, it seems. So this poem is called Harriet Tubman, Beauty Queen, or Ain't I a Woman? And it has 2 epigraphs, which I will read. This place has made us heroines, not wives, and kept us from its sparkles and its paints, and made us dull in natural disguise. That's from Conversation Overheard in a Graveyard by Lucille Clifton. And then, no disrespect, but Harriet Tubman ugly as hell. Cashiers ain't even gonna accept the money. That's a tweet by @RealKingJosh from April 20th, 2016. That's of course in reference to Tubman being on the $20 bill. And I'm sure Dr. Foster has many a thought about that. I have some thoughts myself. Maybe somebody will ask about it later. But anyway, that's what that's referencing. Look there. Don't you see the way they slope? My breasts, the shadows where milk might have dropped, if only I'd been born woman instead of slave woman. What sparkles and paints could I choose? No rouge could flush this face. No powder could trap this unstoppable Black. How funny, you call me rough. All I see is softness, the way my lips pillow out. Even my scowl you'll want to pucker and peck. My nose, it will snort the whole damn Mason-Dixon in one drag. North Star, promised constellation, you my mirror. What can I see except my own face when I see you, heaven's compass and jewel? And I looked at a lot of pictures of Tubman, actually, thank you, thank you, when I wrote that poem. And she had, I mean, a particular look. I don't know what I would look like if I had run by foot all those miles, you know. She looked, you know, like she'd lived quite a life. But all I could see in her was just great beauty, and all I could feel was gratefulness, honestly, for what she endured during her life. So this actually weaves very easily into the next poet I want to bring into the room. This woman named Lucille Clifton, who is my most favorite poet of all time. I referenced her work in the previous piece, and the piece that I referenced actually is another version of the piece I'm about to read by her. And Clifton is one of these authors who unfortunately isn't taught enough just in the poetry classroom, but also I think she's not considered enough as a real just light in Black poetics. If you ask any Black poet who's alive right now about their influences, 9 times out of 10, Lucille Clifton is going to be there. She's maybe not the loudest, you know, poet in the world. She and Sonia Sanchez were friends, and I often think about them together, you know, Sonia Sanchez, Sister Sonia, I should say. I'm Southern. I don't really like calling people by their first name if they are my elder. Sister Sonia is this fiery, you know, tiny little woman who just explodes everywhere. So you can't miss her. And Lucille, Miss Lucille, although I didn't know her, she seemed to move in a certain quietness, but her work was always very loud and always showed up for Black people and for women in ways that I think should be valued a lot more. She is a part of any conversation about Black poetics, about feminism, about Black feminism. She's there. Her work addresses it all. So this piece by her is called Black Women. And like I said, it is another version of the piece that I referenced in the previous poem. Oh, thank you, David Squires. I'm so glad you like this doc I put together. I thought it was rather cute myself. Black Women by Lucille Clifton. America made us heroines, not wives. We learned the tricks to keep the race together, but had to leave our men to find themselves, and now they damn what they cannot forgive. Even old Massa's son lives in a dream, remembering the lie we made him love. America made us heroines, not wives. We hid our ladiness to save our lives. So I used this poem to write the poem I'm going to read now, which is by me. It's in my new book, Reparations Now, which will come out in September. And it's in a form called The Golden Shovel, which I think is very appropriate for this talk, because in the Golden Shovel form, which I have some notes on the doc about where it comes from, that form, you literally take the words of someone else and they become a part of your poem. So in the shovel format, you take a pre-existing piece, and if you read down the right margin of your poem, it is the entirety of that poem that you started with. Hopefully that makes some sense. And so in this way, I'm literally walking with Lucille Clifton through this poem, and she's a part of, you know, the conversation very directly, which is part of what happens in at least the poetic space. I'm sure in other spaces too. These foremothers leave us with things, and sometimes we're able to even meet them, and they leave us with knowledge, techniques, whatever, their spirits, and it's up to us to then take that and allow them to walk with us, but also create another path. So this poem is doing that, and also talking about the necessity of Black women in the South and in the country, in the world, in the universe, whatever you want to say. I cannot talk about the South without talking about Black women. My grandmothers made America, made the fibers that made us warm, made us invincible, heroines. To tell you who they are, I must start with who they are not. Servants, kitchen-bound mammies, silently obedient wives. We can't, in our modern comforts, imagine the survival they learned was theirs to claim. Can't hold the light they burned through this colonial darkness. What tricks this nation, this American South pulled minute by minute to keep my grandmothers convinced. The body you're in is not enough. Your race and your gender work together to mark you less, to mark you takeable. But what they didn't know was that my grandmothers still had an unmovable strength, enough to build a bridge from here to heaven. I know when I leave this broken earth, I'll find them there, sweetening every hour. My grandmothers raised a generation of American men. There is no other way to say this. Look at any Southern family and you'll find somewhere, in a past most will not claim, a Black woman. These men who call themselves bootstrapping and self-made, somewhere there's a Black woman and her unthanked hands who lifted them to where they are now. My father tells a story of the sons of his grandmother's employers, how they, instead of the pension she was promised, decided to give her a damned old tire, an old suitcase, dusty in the yard. What thanks is this for the years she raised that family, for the care they cannot forget. My father could never forgive those men, their Southern tradition, their American tradition. Even now, they tell us Black women are going to save this whole nation with votes or magic or our style taken and renamed. But this is no longer the land of masses and mammies, and we are only superheroines for our own daughters and sons. My grandmothers did not give their lives for me to keep nursing this country, to keep shucking and jiving in a bizarro American dream. My grandmothers are worth more than this corrupt remembering. Now there is no room for the Dixieland lie. We no longer hold these truths you made us accept. Under God, yes. We hear him singing a song of powerful love, despite the united hate of America. Grandmothers, women made of salt and spirit, you are faith continuous. Continue us. Raise us to be heroes and heroines, to tell this country that we are not mules, not beasts. You, an army of workers and wives, we hid our fears and woes in your indestructible, ever-present ladiness. The blood you pass down to us is all we will ever need to save our lives. All right. Interestingly, that poem was commissioned by Garden and Gun magazine, which is interesting because that's not exactly, the foremost, progressive, I guess, magazine. But when I was asked to write, I said to the editor, you know what I write, right? Like, you understand I'm going to be writing about Black people. And she's like, oh yeah, we love it. And so I was like, cool, let me get up in the Garden and Gun space and, disrupt whatever's going on in there already. Thank y'all. Okay, so moving on to my second phase, I broke it up. If you look in the document, I have 3 sections here. And the first was just like a foundational section, those people who kind of started me on my way, because I found Clifton actually while I was an undergrad searching for Black poetics, while I studied in a very white English department in Alabama. Which is not to say that other departments in other states are Blacker. They definitely are not, but I just happened to be in Alabama. And when I found her, I kind of turned another corner in my poetic journey. So now I want to turn to formal poetry as resistance and those spirits that guide us. And I'm going to look at Gwendolyn Brooks and Sonia Sanchez alongside some of my work. And I've linked in the document a couple of other pieces by Brooks you might want to look at. There's A Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi, Meanwhile a Mississippi Mother Burns Bacon, which is about Emmett Till and Carolyn Bryant. And then The Ballad of Rudolph Reed, which is about a Black family moving into a white neighborhood and the violence that ensues. And I've also got some other things linked on the side just to explain. There is a double golden shovel by Patricia Smith, who is a contemporary poet who everyone should read always. She is incredible, an incredible formalist as well. And she did a double golden shovel of Brooks's piece, the last quatrain of the Ballad of Emmett Till, which is a continuation of the Mississippi Mother Burns Bacon piece. If there's any additional questions about this, y'all can ask me. Hopefully this is all very clear. But the poem that I put in the doc, and I think I'm not going to read it from now on. I might just kind of skip around with the poems that I read by others, just to get some of my work into your ears, because that's, I guess, why I'm here. But I will describe this poem, Kitchenette Building by Gwendolyn Brooks, which you can actually hear her reading if you search online. This poem is an almost sonnet. It's 13 lines long. And it does follow a rhyme scheme. And this is something that I found that Brooks does a lot in her work, mostly in the early work. In the later work, it's a little more free form. But she's either using form, like the sonnet in her book, Gay Chaps at the Bar, about Black soldiers returning from war, or like in this poem, Kitchenette Building, which, like I said, is almost a sonnet in its line length. And like I said, it uses that rhyme scheme. But she's using these traditional forms to talk about Black people. And this, for me, is a form of resistance. It's saying, okay, we can use your language. I'm thinking too about Phyllis Wheatley, who did a similar thing, using exact, classical form to question the racist ideologies of her time. But Brooks does this too. She writes about Black people using these tools that have been given to us as the right tools or the right way to write. And that's something that I learned from her that I could do as well. I didn't used to like form. I hated it growing up. But once I started to read her work and others like Smith, I realized, okay, this is actually a tool that I can use for the poetic merit of those forms, but also to write about my people. Brooks is very interesting for that reason. And also because she willfully left, I believe it was Harper that she was published on, to go to, is it Broadside Press? I think that's what it's called, but it's a Black press. And she did that purposefully because she was committed to Blackness in a way that others maybe weren't at the time. Like she was willing to sacrifice the fame or the security of a very large white press in order to give back to her community and to have a readership that actually understood what she was talking about. So anyway, this poem, Kitchenette Building, talks about, just these people who I assume are Black because she always writes about Black people, people who live in this like tenement building and are sort of settling into the ways that poverty can distract us, but also suggesting that, maybe there is respite from that as well. She's just presenting a very like Black urban scene in this sort of traditional way. And so my answer to that, I mean, I have many answers to Brooks's work, but I decided to pull out a sonnet of my own, which is, I think, doing a similar thing to what I just described Brooks's project to be, which is using the sonnet form to highlight a topic that maybe isn't used or talked about in traditional poetics. This is not a poem about flowers. This is not a poem about, some dear lover. Like, this is a sonnet about racism and how that racism is inherent in America all the way back to its founding, not just in this imagined evil South where racism, lives and it doesn't live anywhere else. It's not true. It's everywhere. Y'all know that. I know that. I mean, you can turn on the news any moment and realize that. So this poem is called All Y'all Really from Alabama. And it begins with an epigraph from Dr. King, often misquoted and misused. We know that very well. Every Martin Luther King Day is hard to get through because people are misusing that man's words left, right, up, down, side, side. All y'all really from Alabama. The straitjackets of race prejudice and discrimination do not wear only Southern labels. The subtle psychological technique of the North has approached in its ugliness and victimization of the Negro, the outright terror and open brutality of the South. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Why We Can't Wait. This here, the cradle of this here nation. Everywhere you look, roots run right back south. Every vein filled with red dirt, blood, cotton. We the dirty words you spit out your mouth. Mason-Dixon is an imagined line. You can theorize it, wish it real, but it's the same old ghost, see-through, benign. All y'all from Alabama. We the wheel turning cotton to make the nation move. We the scapegoat in a land built from death. No longitude or latitude disproves the truth of founding fathers' sacred oath. We hold these truths like dark snuff in our jaw. Black oppression's not happenstance, it's law. So I'm keeping my eye on the time and I'm going to move into Sonia Sanchez, who is still living. That is important to say, and we hope she remains living for many more years. Her collected works actually is coming out in a couple of weeks. I urge you to pre-order that wherever books are sold. You're welcome, Clancy. It's nice to know there's another Alabamian here as well. I'm so glad that that poem spoke to you. So yeah, Sister Sonia is also from Alabama, as Dr. Foster said. And she has been really instrumental in my life in ways that I never imagined. Yeah, she's 86. And she's still kicking. She's still feisty as ever. She's awesome. Anyway, I came upon her work at UAB through Dr. Jacqueline Wood, who is an amazing teacher and who is a Sonia Sanchez scholar. And I worked as her research assistant, gathering primary resources on Ms. Sanchez for a book that Dr. Wood was putting together. And at the time, I just thought, okay, yeah, this poet was really awesome. I'm never gonna meet her. Like, you know, I'm really glad she exists, all this kind of stuff. But fast forward to 2019, I actually got to meet Ms. Sanchez a couple of times, and we became, I don't want to say friends because that feels presumptuous, but she knows who I am, and we talk sometimes. That whatever that is, that's what we are. I am her student, I'll say it that way. But she was very instrumental in the development of Black studies at the university level, and she is just one of the foremost fighters for Blackness and for poetry, honestly, in the Black space and in other spaces as well. She also works with form. She teaches in form also. She always says that people who take her classes are surprised to learn that she teaches them form, because she's this very like cool, you know, radical kind of poet. And she always says, well, that's how I learned poetry, and learning form can help you to then write out of form, you know, the same idea of kind of what I brought up with Gwendolyn Brooks, using form as a tool rather than as a cage, you know, forced upon us by, you know, the ivory tower. And so what I've linked here in the document is from her book, Does Your House Have Lions?, which is actually a book-length poem written in rhyme royal. And if you've ever read the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, that's rhyme royal. He like popularized it way, way back in the day. Yeah, exactly, Dr. Foster, about jazz. So she wrote in this form about her brother returning, or coming rather, to New York from Alabama, and sort of the fractured family trying to come back together. That's maybe a short enough synopsis. And so what you have here is just an excerpt from the first part of it, which I'm not going to read here, again, in the interest of time, but it is here for you to read. I really encourage you to read that whole book. It's really quite fascinating and very well done in this very rigid form of rhyme royal. I've also put in the doc one of my own rhyme royal pieces, which explores sexuality and religion in an interesting way, or at least I think it's interesting. Y'all can tell me if you think it's interesting too, but it's from my first book. What I wanted to actually read to y'all, and I think maybe after this piece, I may jump to my last piece, just so we have time for questions. So what I want to read to y'all right now are two paired sonnets. So again, using form to maybe subvert something. Two paired sonnets that are about lynchings that happened almost 100 years apart to the day. One, a lynching of Mary Turner, and one of Stephon Clark in 2018. And the story that I'll tell very quickly before reading it is that I actually read these two poems to Sister Sonia while I was with her at St. Mary's College of Maryland receiving the Lucille Clifton Legacy Award. It was a very overwhelming weekend for me for many reasons, and I do have an essay about it if you'd like to read, you know, what happened. It's linked in the doc. But when I read them, she sat sort of next to me listening, and her eyes were closed, and I was just like scared because I'm like, you're Sonia Sanchez, like why am I even speaking right now? Like you should speak. When I finished, she opened her eyes and she said, now you all I'll see why I chose my dear sister to win this award. And I really could have just passed out, y'all. Like, could have, probably should have. But anyway, that's why I wanted to bring these in, because not only do they follow the tradition on the page of using form that Sanchez and Brooks sort of showed me, but literally I have lived connection with this foremother, you know, with these pieces. Okay, the first one is called Mary Don't You Weep, or Mary Turner Resurrected, and there is an epigraph. When Mary Turner threatened to press charges for the wrongful lynching of her husband in Brooks County, Georgia on May 19, 1918, she was strung upside down, her clothes were burned off, and her unborn baby was cut from her womb and stomped to death. Turner was shot repeatedly, and she and her baby were buried close by their murder site. Like all resurrections, it began with blood, dirt, unending light. The Georgia moss punctuated by camellias, their white hurt stretching across Brooks County. No blight to stain their leaves, just the ash falling bloody from Mary's emblazoned womb. Her baby, afire, its single soft cry still igniting the air. Could it be that even this baby, even this one-breathed angel was crucified to save us all? Maybe. Maybe Mary and her baby flew up from death in sweaty Georgia, her shallow grave shaken loose, finally free, resurrected. It turns out all along hell was earth. What else could she name that rock covered in leaf and loam, not loving, not hopeful, and most certainly not home? Stefan, don't you moan, or to serve and protect. 22-year-old father of two, Stefan Clark, was shot 20 times on March 19th, 2018 by Sacramento police in his grandmother's backyard. The gun police claimed to have seen him carrying was his iPhone. Is there a police protocol for grace? For the moment between show us your hands and shoot? That night, policeman, servant of the gun, did you give space for a man's innocence to bloom? Despite the loaded weight of your finger on the trigger, despite how the night painted that man bigger, made him a giant with a fireball in his hands, despite the loud explosion of your fright. Innocence is for softer things, an open, empty palm, a blooming flower, a spread of rocks becoming sand. Silly civilization, you thought we'd evolved beyond abuse of power. But again, a pruning. What a flower you were, Stefan, and what holiness in your body opening, petaled in the white helicopter light. In this, an Armageddon of bullets, flowers, stars, stripes. Okay. So I'm just going to mention some of the things that I'm not going to get to because I do want to make time for questions. In the doc, you will see, thank you, you'll see June Jordan and Audre Lorde and some of their poems linked, poems and essays linked. If you have not ever read Audre Lorde's poetry or her essays, I urge you to do that. I highly recommend Sister Outsider, her autobiography, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, and also The Black Unicorn, a collection of her poetry. And this poem, Power, which is what's in the document, is one that I've known about for a very long time. I learned about it in high school, actually, which I'm very surprised they let us read a poem that has MFer in it in Alabama, but they did. I mean, I went to an art school, so maybe that's why, but it's a poem that talks about the difference between poetry and rhetoric, which is something that I think about a lot. Lorde says in her poem, the difference between poetry and rhetoric is being ready to kill yourself instead of your children, which is maybe food for thought for all of us, because poetry, as Lorde tells us, is not just the words on the page, but also this quality of light. She describes it, a quality of light that is within us, this innate power that we have. And so maybe we all should be striving toward poetry and toward Lorde's Black feminist ideology as well. But that's in there, as well as a poem of mine about frustration with America. Many of my poems are about that. And then June Jordan, I would also urge you to read her works. I think her collected is coming pretty soon from Copper Canyon Press. So I would suggest getting that if you want to dive in to her work. I've listed here, I Must Become a Menace to My Enemies, which is a fantastic poem words to live by, honestly, becoming menacing to those who are menaces to us. And I have a new poem in here, again, about, these people who menace in the lives of Black people. And the last poem in the document is a longer one, which uses George Wallace's 1963 address, kind of repurposed to talk about reparations rather than segregation. But I'm going to stop there because I want to get to questions, if there are any. So I'll invite Dr. Foster to do whatever it is he's got to do to make that happen.
I mean, first we would give you a tremendous loud round of applause in terms of your reading and selection, and couldn't agree more that the Google Doc is the treasure trove of resources that really build upon what you're offering us here. So thank you for that extended archive of this moment. But yeah, I'm curious, folks, questions and comments. I clearly have many. In many ways write and research the historical memory of the civil rights movement through your work. So, we can have a conversation another time, but this is, opening for students, faculty, staff who, are here today and, are in my classes reading Ashley Jones and otherwise.
Oh, thank y'all. I'm just looking at this chat. Y'all are so, thank you. Thank you very much. And if y'all want to, you can pre-order my new book. Look at me shamelessly promoting, but I can actually find some of those links and drop them in the chat. And the festival link too. I think you had said, Dr. Foster, I need to talk about that. So,
yeah, maybe tell us a little bit more about the Magic City Poetry Festival. I think, I know our Department of History, Geography, and Philosophy offers a master's in public history. And, in many ways, I think your work, while it might not be explicitly public history, your poetry definitely engages history, and the history of Birmingham is always very, very present in festivals. So maybe you could tell us more about that kind of public-facing work on top of your poetry and teaching.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. That's too funny, making Alabama look good finally. I mean, yeah, we don't have time for my dissertation on Alabama, but yeah, so the Poetry Festival is a nonprofit here in Alabama, and we do free programming around poetry, community, just celebrating humans, really. And our main event is a festival in April, which is National Poetry Month. And this year it is online. So if anybody wants to sign up, the link to our website is in the chat, and there's registration link and our calendar and all of that. And we're very committed to just valuing artists. We pay everybody who reads for us, which in the world of writing is not always the case, but we're trying to normalize payment, okay? Because this is work, But yeah, we're just very committed to the Alabama community, and to just making people realize that here in Alabama, we do have people with talent. We do have people who need to be heard by others. We shouldn't always just be ashamed of where we're from. I always hated that growing up, that I felt such shame around being Alabamian. And then, when I left, I was like, well, why? Like, why do I feel like I can't be proud of where I'm from? Why do I feel like I can't pour into the community? I can, and I am, I think that's so important. And I definitely do think it's a tool perhaps of some oppressor to make us think that we have to leave our homes to go to these coastal cities to make anything of ourselves. I think that's not true. But yeah, that went off on a little bit of a tangent. I'm still collecting some links to put in this chat. Let's see, I'm gonna put my website in here as well, because that's an easy way to find out anything you want to know, and to contact me as well, if you would like. Okay.
I find that a lot of your poetry can't just be read on an iPhone or screenshot and share. There's a visuality to your poetry as well. Could you say a bit more about that? We were reading the Almost Sonnet poem. I think that's the All Y'all from Alabama.
Oh, it's a
One
sonnet now. Completely a sonnet.
sonnet. Okay. You were talking about the Gwendolyn Brooks novel.
Don't shortchange my little syllables and rhyme.
But you rhymed law and jaw at the end, and it almost looked like you were visualizing a mouth, a jaw, right, in the poetry. I presume that was intentional. And if so, you know, really thinking about that poem with George Wallace, the kind of like 4-part series, what's your orientation to form in that context in terms of how it visually resonates?
Yeah, I mean, I think that poems are more alive than we have allowed them to be in the academy. It's not just an experience on the page. It never has been just an experience on the page. As in, like, here I am studying this poem. I got to count all the syllables. I got to do this. I got to do that. Let me find all the, you know, references that are in it. Like, there's also how it looks on the page that can be doing something really important as well. And it can also work to disrupt some of these systems. Like with some of, like this sonnet that we're talking about, it doesn't look like a regular sonnet, but it does have, if you break it apart into its correct lineation, you can count the 10 syllables. I didn't do the meter. I can do the meter because some people like to try and be like, oh, you just can't do it. That's why you're breaking it. No, I can, but I did not with this one. I just did the syllable count and the rhyme scheme. But the way that it looks on the page is different. It is perhaps more inviting than a traditional sonnet because a reader can see it and think, well, maybe this isn't this impenetrable form that I've been told I can never understand. It's just some words. But also for me with that poem especially, I wanted to group the words together so that they were holding tight to each other and sort of telling a different sort of narrative. I don't know how to really articulate it well, but that's kind of what's going through my mind. And then to separate those last 2 lines, the last couplet, is to signal to the reader, oh, but this is still that thing that you were told was traditional poetry, but also it can look like this too. It's giving room for different ways to exist as a poet and as a reader of poetry.
And really undoing that understanding of the Mason-Dixon line as a kind of traditional,
yes,
you know, spaces where that's also a kind of visual mapped form that you broke.
Yes, I think nothing is real. It's
right?
all an illusion.
We have a question in the chat. I think you can see it. David Squires writes, you move between personal, political, and historical registers really fluidly in the poems you read to us. I wonder about your research process. I agree. Do you set out to learn about historical documents and events for the purpose of writing poetry, or do you come across those materials for other purposes, then repurpose them? I'm curious about your process. And I would echo too, method, right?
Yeah. I have perhaps a non-traditional process in that I am not one of these writers who like wakes up every morning at 5 to sit at the desk and do the work. You know, that's not how I'm set up. I mean, I did a lot of that as a student, you know, because I had deadlines and all that. But now that I'm my own person, you know, I just write at my own pace. So usually what happens is I'm just living my regular life. So that could mean I'm walking down the street, minding my own business, and then I hear or see something that stirs the poem making thing inside me. Or sometimes I will even hear or see a line. Sometimes I can see the shape of a poem in my own head. And this is a strange way to describe it, but maybe if others of you write, or even if you do another kind of art, you can kind of like, you think in that thing. So I do sort of think in poems, interestingly enough. So sometimes I will, you know, be reading something or researching just for my own, you know, fun, you know, and I see something that becomes a poem, or there's something I want to understand more, and I have to understand it through writing a poem. So yeah, sometimes I am, you know, researching on my own. Like for Harriet Tubman, I knew that I wanted to write about her, so I just started reading about her first, and then I wrote. But for, I don't know, let's see, who's another, the Stefan Clark pair of sonnets that I read, that like had just happened. So I was thinking about it. And I don't even remember how Mary Turner came into the picture. Somehow she entered a room that I was in, whether like it was on Facebook, somebody posted or whatever. And the dates struck me so much that I had to go to the page. I started to see the pieces. And at the time too, I was listening to Aretha Franklin's version of Mary Don't You Weep, which is one of my favorite, you know, old Negro spirituals, whatever we want to call that, you know, and so that came into the room as well. So it's a mixture. The process is very organic for me. You know, it just sometimes it's research first, sometimes it's research second, sometimes it's during, or all the above. Sometimes there's none if I already know enough about the subject.
Well, that's really helpful. I had a question about the connection between Turner and Clark, for you as well. We did have a question from Clancy Radcliffe about, have you written any poetry about that part of Alabama, Florence, Alabama, Muscle Shoals? Clearly you write about Birmingham and Magic City Gospel, but Alabama more broadly seems to be on your mind as well. All y'all from Alabama. What's the relationship between that kind of space, I guess we could say?
Yeah, I haven't written specifically about that part of Alabama because I'm really just starting to get to know that part of Alabama. I've only been up there a few times. I've actually never stayed long enough in Muscle Shoals to really understand the place. But I am in a moment in my life and career right now where I'm very interested in just knowing more about the state as a whole and the literary landscape of it as well. To that end, we have started a reading series at the festival that's going to travel throughout the state for this exact reason, so that I and others, we can all, understand who's here and what has happened all over the state as well. So no, I haven't. To answer your question, I have not written about it, but it's not to say that I won't ever write about it.
You will. I'm confident. Dean Kellman asked, you mentioned that commission from Gun and Garden magazine. How did that happen? Is that normal for a professional poet to receive commissions?
Well, Dean, I don't know about everybody, but people seem to find me, sometimes. It was a surprise to me. Let me start there. I was surprised to receive this message. People usually will contact me through my website. And so I was pretty used to that for readings, but this editor contacted me and she was just like, well, we're putting together this book called Southern Women. And we are fans of your work here at the magazine. And by the way, I don't know how people find me. I actually have no idea where any of this is happening. But she, said she was a fan of my work and she wondered if I would do a poem to open the book. And she also told me a dollar amount that was incredible to me, because as poets, we're not always compensated fairly for our work, but this was the biggest commission for a single poem I've ever received. And so I was very scared by that as well. But that's kind of how that happened. I just got a message. This person had seen my work somewhere, I don't know where. So I think it's normal if you have a big enough, or if you have any sort of online presence, or if you've traveled enough that people can kind of start telling others about you, that people will kind of reach out. Because it is a lot about who you know in the writing world, in any world, but in the writing world especially, people refer you often. So sometimes it will manifest in something like that.
We're almost out of time, but there was one last question that I think, ties up how you began the talk with that quote from June Jordan and what you offer to your teaching, right? The question was, I'm really moved by your use of form as resistance. Does this manifest in your own teaching? And I would ask, how, given that you certainly bring a lot to offer to the classroom and teach creative writing, right? So how does that show up in the classroom, especially given what we're doing now with Zoom University, right?
Yes.
What's that been like?
I guess I'll just start by saying I started naming my pedagogy as feminist pedagogy in grad school. One, because I had to, they asked us, what is your pedagogy? And I was like, well, I got to come up with something. But also at the time I was studying Audre Lorde, and everything that she said, Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, actually, everything that she said about how we are to live in the world and how we each have a voice that should be valued and how feminism actually helps everyone, that seemed to make perfect sense with the way that I wanted to teach, which is to resist in the classroom by my syllabus. For one, I teach primarily authors of color. If we're going to get specific, I would say 80% of my syllabus is Black people, which I have never apologized for. And I'm trying very hard to incorporate other underrepresented communities. I've been teaching some Native writers, and I really want to get better at like African writers too. I'm so woefully undereducated on those writers. But anyway, I try to resist in that way, but also in the way that I treat my students. I tell them on the first day of class, usually, I'm not the keeper of all knowledge at all. That is not who I am. I will never be the keeper of all knowledge. Don't see me as that. We're here together, learning together. I'm sharing things with you, you'll share things with me, and your voice is valuable in the classroom. Mine is not the only voice that has value, which is a very, I think, feminist way of orienting. And so that's sort of how I teach. And I teach, form as well in a similar way as Sonia Sanchez does. Hopefully that's a good enough answer quickly.
No, that's great. And that wraps up our time. Again, if we had the full Zoom on call, I'm sure you'd hear a lot of clapping, and, hopefully one day you'll be able to make it down to Lafayette, Louisiana. But we're more than grateful for your time today, and wish you the best next month with the Majesty Poetry Festival, which we'll be tuning into virtually. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here.